When you think of trenches, bayonets, and barbed wire, you see World War I. You see soldiers buried in mud under artillery fire, clouds of poison gas, and those terrible 4 years that claimed the lives of millions of young men. But this war also had an invisible front. A war fought in gold vaults, bond markets, the dark corridors of central banks, and in the quiet offices of financiers who never set foot on the battlefield. Soldiers paid for this war with their lives. But bankers and governments continued calculating their balance sheets. The decisions they made in those years didn't just determine who would win and who would lose. They reshaped the global financial system in ways that still affect your life today. If you think war is only about politics, generals, and armies, think again. World War I proved one of history's most ruthless truths. Money is a weapon. Perhaps the deadliest weapon ever invented. Let's go back to the summer of 1914. Europe was already a powder keg. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and complex military alliances had turned the continent into a giant chessboard. Everyone was suspicious of everyone else. Every empire was secretly preparing for war. But beneath all the rhetoric about empire lay a financial reality. Without unimaginable amounts of money, winning a war of this scale was impossible. Here was the ruthless truth of that era. When leaders chose war, they unknowingly chose debt as well. Every empire that sent its soldiers to the front was simultaneously placing its people under an economic burden that would last for generations. Could they grasp the magnitude of this? No. At the start of the war, most governments and military leaders were confident it would be short. "We'll be home by Christmas," they said. It would be a conflict of a few weeks, a few months at most. They thought they could pay for the war the old-fashioned way, with gold reserves, limited borrowing, and patriotic donations. Within weeks, these assumptions were shattered. Money was being spent at a pace no one could have imagined. The first great war of the industrial age. This modern hell filled with machine guns, heavy artillery, tanks, and chemical weapons, was exponentially more expensive than any previous war. In the summer of 1914, Europe's financial system was built on the gold standard. What did this mean? A simple but powerful promise. Every country guaranteed that its paper money could be exchanged for real gold. You could go to the central bank and convert your banknotes into gold. This system gave currencies credibility. But it also tied governments' hands. Gold reserves were limited. You couldn't print unlimited money. If you tried, you would lose the trust of your people and your creditors. Britain, France, and Germany all had respectable gold reserves. But when millions of soldiers were mobilized and industry was redirected toward arms production, costs skyrocketed. Consider the numbers. Germany was spending over 10 million marks per day by the autumn of 1914. Britain's war costs would soon reach £2.5 million daily. Every day. Without pause. The math was merciless. Gold would not be enough. It was that simple. And so governments suspended the rules. One by one, the great powers abandoned the gold standard. They quietly confessed to their citizens. From now on, money is a promise based on nothing but faith in the state. That moment, the moment the gold anchor was cut loose, was one of the most important financial turning points in modern history. It revealed how fragile the so-called real wealth of nations truly was. Money and power had now been severed from metal and were being managed through printing presses, credit, and the power of persuasion. And once governments tasted this freedom, they never went back. The financial war had now become serious. And every country was fighting with different weapons. For Germany, the situation was particularly difficult. It was isolated from global capital markets. The British Royal Navy controlled the seas. German ships were trapped in their ports. Foreign borrowing became impossible. Berlin's only option was domestic borrowing. And so massive bond campaigns began. Posters appealing to patriotism were plastered on the streets. Images of heroically fighting soldiers, slogans demanding sacrifice from families. Buy war loans, invest your savings for the fatherland, and after victory, every penny will be repaid with interest. The propaganda machine worked relentlessly. And the Germans believed. In total, Germany raised over 100 billion marks this way. An enormous sum. But it was all a pyramid built on hope. When the war was lost, these bonds turned to garbage. Millions of Germans watched their lifetime savings evaporate in an instant. Economic history always leaves traces. And sometimes those traces change the fate of an entire nation. Britain had an advantage, a massive advantage. London was the financial center of the world. The pound sterling was the most trusted currency on the planet. British trade networks extended to every continent. Initially, the government relied on short-term borrowing and patriotic appeals. But soon it tapped into the deep pools of global credit. And most importantly, it turned to the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral. But American bankers had smelled opportunity. Giant firms like J.P. Morgan and Company became the financial lifeline of Britain and France. They arranged massive loans and managed the purchase of weapons, food, and raw materials. By the time America entered the war in 1917, Wall Street had been financing the Allied cause for years. This wasn't philanthropy. This was real power. American banks earned millions in commissions. And the United States emerged from the war as a completely different country. Transformed from a debtor to a creditor, from a financial follower to a global leader. If you've ever wondered why the 20th century was called the American century, here is the starting point. This story was written not on battlefields, but in accounting ledgers. France was experiencing its own dilemmas. It still bore the wounds of its 1870 defeat to Prussia. It had invested in defensive lines, precursors to the Maginot Line, but war expenses were draining the treasury. French citizens were historically known for their frugality and savings habits. The government exploited this trait. It launched major campaigns to sell war bonds. But most of the deep funds still came from across the Atlantic. France, like Britain, became increasingly dependent on American capital. This dependency would shape policy after the war. When debts accumulated, the question of repayment became a source of international tension. When you hear about the economic crises of the interwar period, remember that it wasn't just about reparations or stock market crashes. There was also the crushing weight of debt accumulated during those 4 years of slaughter. As for Russia's financial war was a complete disaster. The empire was vast in territory but economically underdeveloped. Its banking system was fragile, and its gold reserves, while impressive on paper, were inadequate in practice. To finance the war's costs, Russia borrowed heavily from its allies, especially France. But as defeats mounted and inflation rose, confidence in the ruble collapsed. By 1917, the Russian economy was in ruins, and the political system collapsed with it. The fall of the Tsarist regime wasn't just due to ideology or bad generals. The real breaking point was the consequence of the financial system. Economic errors, monetary chaos, and inflation made the revolution even worse. Once again, money and power walked through history together. The scale of financial losses was beyond comprehension. The wealthy elites knew how to protect themselves. They invested their assets abroad, put money into real goods, real estate, and precious metals. They stayed close to the power centers where information leaked first. The lesson was ruthless but clear. In a financial war, the small saver is always the first casualty. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world looked like a battlefield not just in the trenches, but in the balance sheets as well. The United States had been a debtor nation before the war. Now it possessed the world's largest gold reserves and the greatest creditor position in history. By the end of the war, the Allied powers had spent over $140 billion. The Central Powers had spent approximately $60 billion. These were figures the world had never seen before. They far exceeded the combined pre-war national incomes of the warring countries. The result was not just mountains of debt. It was the complete destruction of the old financial order. The gold standard, the foundation of global trust, had been shattered. Inflation was tearing economies to shreds. Germany would soon face such extreme hyperinflation that a loaf of bread would cost billions of marks. People would have to rush to spend their wages the day they received them, because by the next day the money would be worthless. And as always, the ones who paid the price were ordinary people. Workers, small savers, modest investors. Europe, the old heart of global finance, was drowning in debt. Britain owed America over $4 billion. France owed over $3 billion. Even smaller nations were struggling with obligations they could never realistically repay. The war had made Wall Street the new financial capital of the planet. It had replaced London in a way no war could have achieved otherwise. The age of American dominance in money and power had begun. But this transition was not smooth. Because here's the trap. When wars are financed through borrowing, repayment itself becomes a war. Britain and France were desperate to remain loyal to the citizens who had bought war bonds. And they had to find that money somewhere. The answer was Germany. War reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an astronomical figure, 132 billion gold marks. It was meant to punish, to cripple, and to shift the burden onto the defeated. But it was also a fantasy. Germany simply could not pay. Attempts at payment, whether by printing money or transferring goods, only destabilized the economy further. The hyperinflation of 1923, the period when Germans carried worthless banknotes in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread, was not an accident. It was the direct consequence of a financial system pushed to the breaking point by impossible debts. And it planted the seeds of anger that insurgents would later exploit. Meanwhile, Britain was trying to restore its financial prestige. In 1925, it returned to the gold standard. It pegged the pound to its old pre-war value. This was an economic error of monumental proportions. The British economy was devastated. Its industrial base had weakened. Its debts had grown to enormous proportions. Restoring the pound to its old parity was like forcing a broken bone back into place without healing it. The result was deflation, unemployment, and social unrest. This policy, championed by figures like Winston Churchill, is now remembered as one of the worst financial miscalculations in modern economic history. And once again, ordinary workers paid the price. The elites clung to the idea of restored greatness. The United States, overflowing with gold and credit, faced a different challenge. What to do with this new dominance? American banks began pumping money into Europe. They were lending to Germany so Germany could pay its reparations. The reparations went to Britain and France so they could repay their debts to America. As crazy as it sounds, that was exactly the thinking. This was a financial merry-go-round. It appeared stable on the surface, but its cycle was built on circular logic. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 institutionalized this flow. Money was being recycled, not created. And when the global economy was shaken by the Great Depression, the entire structure collapsed. The world had never been so financially interconnected, and it had never been so fragile. Here is the connection that matters for you today. World War I was the moment when governments learned that by severing money from reality, they could finance the unimaginable. They discovered they could suspend gold, print unlimited money, issue bonds to their own citizens, borrow across borders, and then repair the wreckage with propaganda and restructuring. Does this sound familiar? Because that playbook has never been lost. Every modern crisis, from the Great Depression to the 2008 global financial meltdown, carries the traces of 1914. When governments or central banks say this is a temporary measure, when they insist that we need to build solid foundations, remember that they said the same things in 1914. Millions of people believed them, until they realized the currency in their hands was worthless. Now think about your life today. When central banks promise that inflation is transitory, when governments expand debt ceilings year after year, when new money is created digitally with the push of a button, remember 1914. Remember that the gold standard was abandoned not by accident, but deliberately, in a moment of desperation. Remember that the pattern of borrowing against the future, printing money to meet the present, and selling bonds with patriotic slogans is more than a century old. Every financial crisis of the modern era has its roots in those war years. From the stagflation of the 1970s to the subprime collapse of 2008. The same illusions are still at work. And the same people, ordinary savers, middle-class workers, small investors, are still the ones making the sacrifices. The hidden financial struggle behind World War I is not a relic of the past. It is the foundation of today. The lesson is harsh but necessary. When money is severed from reality, it becomes a tool of manipulation. Governments will always find ways to finance wars, bailouts, and crises, and they will always force you to pay the price through taxes, inflation, or the erosion of your savings. Real wealth is not the numbers on a screen or the promises of politicians. Real wealth is resilience, knowledge, and the ability to see beyond illusions. That is the only financial freedom history allows. And the final thought I'll leave you with is this: history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The financial playbook written in 1914 has been used again and again, dressed up with new words and presented with new justifications. But the outcome is always the same. Those in power protect themselves, and those without knowledge are sacrificed. The most important lesson you should take from this story is this: never assume money is real just because it's printed. Never assume the system is stable just because authorities say so. The truth is always hidden in the balance sheets. And history is the only teacher that doesn't lie. If this has given you a new perspective, subscribe. History holds the answers. I'll show you where to look.